warn their husbands of impending dangers, and in numerous cases promoted their husbands' interests above those of their own relatives. Their informal meeting places allowed for a more unrestricted flow of information from a broad range of sources that was especially useful in legal cases brought before their husbands. By contrast, men used the more formal mejlises of the ruler to promote their public images and communicate information they wanted known. The role of women in marriage negotiations is well known in the Middle East, both in terms of initiating the search for an appropriate bride and in evaluating a bride in face-to-face encounters. Women frequently promoted marriage to their own tribes to keep them involved in the circles of influence over generations. Mother-son relations were extremely close in tribal society, with women working tirelessly to promote their sons' interests with their ruler husbands. To keep the peace between half-brothers, rulers would try to distribute influential positions and strategic marriages fairly among the mother blocks of sons. Influencing a ruler to give her son special treatment took strategic skill and persistence. And 3 of the Emirates now have rulers or crown princes who are not the logical candidates in the line of succession. And there is little doubt that this happened because of their mother's influence. There's an excellent book on the Ottoman Empire called Imperial Harem, and I've forgotten the author's name, but it shows the extent to which women actually pulled the strings in the Ottoman Empire. A final point is that at the time when rulers were being assassinated at high rates, their wives often raised their sons in their own families until they were eligible for succession. A number of recent rulers grew up in other emirates in their mothers' families and now appoint members of their mothers' tribes to influential positions. It's one of those ways of balancing tribal sections. It may already be obvious why women's invisibility helped. The enemy of a ruler rarely knew much about the women of the household or how active they might be in supporting his agenda. Their invisibility consequently made it much easier to act in the ways I've mentioned, and as a result, the women added an unknown dimension to a ruler's assets that the enemy had little means of gauging. In Simple Gestures, the book we're talking about now, the content also covers a broad range of issues, but again, because of time limits, I'll focus on women by reading a shortened excerpt about Afghan women to give you an idea of how the 2 books differ in their approaches. Between 1998 and 2000, I was working on Afghan education programs for UNICEF. The education officer, Ellen, sent letters out across Afghanistan to recruit Afghan educators to write textbooks for primary classrooms. But on the day the workshop opened, neither she nor the facilitator, Muna, knew how many would respond. The first morning in Peshawar, one recruit was patiently waiting in the hotel lobby. She was carrying a baby and was accompanied by her 11-year-old nephew. Halima had taken a bus from Mazar-e-Sharif, around 300 miles away, down to the Pakistani border, walked over the mountains because she had no passport, and continued by bus to Peshawar. Her husband had recently died, and she had left 4 other children with relatives. Her nephew served as her male escort, as the Taliban required, and while she worked, he took care of the baby. "Why did she come?" Muna asked her. "To help my country," she replied. The second woman, Razia, was a refugee living in Peshawar, where she had managed to finish high school, teach herself English, and learn computer skills. Her father was dead, and her mother was determined Razia's reputation would remain pristine so she could marry well. When the workshop moved to distant Islamabad, her mother said Razia could no longer attend because she would have to stay out overnight. Razia negotiated a compromise whereby she took a 3-hour bus ride to Islamabad each morning and returned on the bus another 3 hours in the evening. Several years later, she was offered a scholarship to go to a U.S. college, but her mother again refused until she married a cousin, and they went together to the U.S. In these examples, Razia and Halima were no more dedicated than the men on the project, who were 70 Afghan educators. but the obstacles they overcame were far greater. In the end, they accomplished their goals by acting within the limits they believed would conserve their reputations and the reputations of their families. They saw their actions as an accommodation that preserved their own best long-term interests. An anthropologist who, unfortunately, I've forgotten her name, once termed this the nice girl concept, the limitations people of any society place on themselves to appear good moral people. In the case of Halima using an escort and Razia coming home each night. In the final chapters of both books, I draw conclusions about Middle Eastern cultures that to me come out of these experiences. These conclusions, no doubt, are oversimplifications, as anthropologists warn against, but I believe there's some validity in how they suggest ways personal relations in the Middle East differ from the way Americans would behave in similar situations. Here are three observations from simple gestures. The most obvious difference is the overwhelming loyalty Middle Easterners feel toward their groups, their families, their tribes, their co-religionists. Even when the loyalties lie dormant for long periods, they're readily activated when challenged. The Shia-Sunni divide, so apparent in Iraq now, rarely surfaced before the war. Because people become members of their groups at birth, these memberships are hard to abandon, and the links, therefore, give enduring connection to people's relations. These loyalties go far deeper than the ones family-loving Americans profess. Americans see groups as jumping-off points for personal fulfillment, while Middle Easterners generally see investing in groups as a long-term benefit, even when it means subordinating their own interests to those of the groups. A corollary of this loyalty is the second point, the strong sense of personal obligation to others. Middle Easterners locate themselves within circles of personal relationship where each circle is defined by the specific obligations members feel they owe one another. In the immediate family, parents owe nurturing and protection to the young, while children owe elders respect and obedience. All this is tied to a hierarchy of age where older members, male and female, have more authority. The variety and extent of the obligations diminishes as family connections become more distant, but they never cease entirely. Other circles of relationship include people of the same religious faiths, work colleagues, friends, and schoolmates, each circle with acknowledged sets of obligations. Even the weakest connections with foreigners call for duties of hospitality and generosity in return for support and goodwill. These obligations are not hollow prescriptions. They carry with them a moral mandate, what it means to be a good person. Compare this sense of duty with American siblings worrying more about whether their parents treat them equally than in showing deference to their elders. The third related point is the importance of religious underpinnings to human relations. From the Muslim perspective, obligations are divinely inspired through religious documents that lay out in the minutest detail the behaviors appropriate for Muslims. Sharia legal principles derive from the Quran, while their application is based on the Sunnah, or examples from the life and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. By the mid-10th century, Sunni religious scholars had categorized all human behavior into what was obligatory